Right, our reading this morning is from the book of Esther, and it's chapter 2 and verses 1 to 18. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favour, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation, according to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation apportioned: 6 months of oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favour in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favour in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. Amen.
Good morning. It's so good to be back sharing the next instalment of the story of Esther. But before I do, I just want to share something just to refresh your memories about the last time I shared, where we talked about Xerxes, because I found it hard to say Ahasuerus, King Xerxes, same person. And we talked about him and Vashti. And in the month since then, I found some more information about him which I just had to share with you, because it helps us further understand what kind of a person the king was. Ahasuerus, by the way, I found this, I'm just reading it, had a violent temper, and it displayed itself in this action against his queen. Just a year later, we talked about this. In order for his massive army to march from Turkey, where they were established, into Greece, he ordered that the bridges be built across the Hellespont. That's the narrow piece of water between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. They needed to get through there to get to Greece. The bridges, however, were destroyed in a storm before the troops were able to use them. Ahasuerus, Xerxes, was furious that the storm had destroyed the bridges they'd built. Remember, this is history, this is true. He thought they had been built inadequately by the engineers. So he gathered all the engineers together and chopped their heads off. I'll give you an idea of the person we're dealing with. He then was furious with the water. So Herodotus, the historian, the Greek historian, he wrote this, says that he sent soldiers into the water with whips, demanding that they lash the ocean 300 times for its insubordination. Then he sent soldiers who threw shackles into the water to bind the water and stab the waves with red-hot irons. This is irrational rage, obviously. This may be a bit of an explanation as to why he treated his queen the way he did. I thought she'd get off in a way quite lightly, because she didn't get her head chopped off, she was just deposed and put aside. But what a nutcase of a man. He's the man that Esther's going to be dealing with. Anyway, on to today's sharing. Now, I'm going to do things a little different. I'm going to give you the title of this sharing in a moment, and then I'm going to introduce you to the next character, Esther. Now, I need to point out that this time of the year, about March, is the Jewish festival of Purim, which is directly related to events that are going to come up in the next sharing, whenever that is. So but we are going to talk about Esther today. When I've finished sharing, I'm going to ask you if you've worked out any of the 4 things that I'm going to share. If you listen carefully, you will hear the 4 things mentioned in order. Now, the sharing is called 4 Things About Esther That Nobody Talks About. Okay, so those 4 things are going to be mentioned as I go through. You might be able to pick out 1, 2, maybe, 3, and we'll see. It's not a test. I just thought it'd be something different. So, we've got the background, because I've just read about the king and the sort of temperament he's got. So 4 years pass and there's still no queen, and according to Esther chapter 2, the answer is found as to why 4 years. Well, it was found in his 2-year unsuccessful invasion of Greece, and we've just read about it. The invasion of Greece happens in 2 years and it occupies him, so he can't deal with the issue of establishing a queen. But then we saw what happened with his invasion of Greece, not successful at all. So he's frustrated, so he comes back home, and it's decided that he needs a distraction and he better get another queen. So as we've had read to us by Jan, in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, all these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants, now it's interesting, it says servants, who said to him, let beautiful young virgins be bought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all of his kingdom, so that they can gather all the beautiful young virgins into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch. Now that's a harem, in case you're wondering. and let the beauty preparations be given to them. And then the young woman who pleases the king will be queen instead of Vashti. Now, he thinks this is a great idea. Well, okay, so this is going to be actually, if you think about this, just let's get this in perspective. It's going to be an empire-wide, and we know how big that empire, huge that empire was, beauty contest. Now, we can make a bit of an assumption here that they reckon there were about 50 million people in the Persian Empire at that time. So we could think that there's an odd average of, there might be 25 million women. So that's the scene. And so the Bible text introduces us to the main characters in the story out of all those people. 2 Jewish people who were cousins. They live in the city of Shushan as well. Now, they are descendants of the original Jewish captives who were bought by Nebuchadnezzar in the Babylonian captivity. They'd been brought to Babylon about a century ago. So the older of the 2 is a man called Mordecai, and he's roughly about 15 years older than his young cousin, an orphan named Esther. In verse 7 it tells us that her parents had died when she was very young, and so Mordecai had raised her. So think about it. In the middle of 50 million people in the Persian Empire, there are these 2 Jewish people. Now, her name in Hebrew is Hadassah, which means myrtle, that's the plant. Her Persian name, Esther, may be related to Ishtar, that's one of the Babylonian gods. So she could have been called Star. But Esther was not her Jewish name. But the Jews in exile were given Persian names, like Daniel and his 3 friends. The 3 friends originally were Azariah, Mishael and Hananiah, but they became Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, Babylonian names, because that was the custom of the time. Now, the Bible text, chapter 2, verse 7, says it just so happens that this young virgin by the name of Esther was lovely and beautiful. Lovely and beautiful. Well, she didn't go unnoticed by the king's officials. So she was collected up in the group that were to go to the palace and live in the harem with the concubines and participate in the contest for the queen. Josephus, the historian, says that there were 400 virgins who were taken to the palace. 400? Esther's one of 400. The thing that went from whatever the amount of women they had first, they got them down to the number of 400 most beautiful women, and they were taken to the palace because they were going to be there for a year, and they were going to be allowed to work on themselves for that year. And at some point when the year was over, they'd be presented to the king and he would make his choice. One of the 400 is going to be elevated to be queen. Imagine it. They had a year of primping and getting fixed up, but nevertheless, I don't exactly know what might have gone on, but it was a year of beautification. They were to look as beautiful as possible. Well, we know from the Bible reading they were to smell as good as possible. They were to use incense, cosmetics. They were to enhance their skin, and enhance their hair, develop fragrances. Sounds like one of those, I remember years ago, Elizabeth Arden had this ad, you use this product, you'd notice a difference in 10 days. 10 days you'd be younger. I used it 10 years and it still didn't make much difference to me. But these women, 400 of them, they're there for a year. They were given special instruction on court etiquette, how you act in the imperial court, and all the expectations for someone when they're around royalty, how you behave. So that goes on for 12 months. Actually, after a while, wouldn't you get sick of it? I don't know. So at the end of 12 months, each of those 400 women would have one opportunity to make an impression on the king and be selected as queen. Again, your chances, 1 of 400, gee. At the time, she could adorn herself with whatever jewellery, whatever apparel she wanted, and she'd be presented to the ruler. This is the bit. After a presentation, she'd go back into the pool. Back to the pool of waiting ladies, other concubines, members of the royal harem, until the king had worked his way through 400 and made his choice. It's not pretty, really, is it, when you think about it? Esther was likely to have been in her 20s at this stage. She's completed the year-long order, and it's her turn to appear before Ahasuerus. Chapter 2, verse 16 says, "So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign." And then this. This is the amazing bit, because there were 400 of them. "The king loved Esther more than all the other women." Well, this must have been a pretty special lady, because I would imagine if you've seen hundreds of them, it would become a bit of a blur. How do you stand out of hundreds? Well, she obtained grace and favour in his sight more than all the other virgins. Just hang on. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants. He proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. Now, this is like a Cinderella story, isn't it? Esther stole the king's heart, and Esther becomes his queen. Just think about it. An obscure Jewish orphan, a child of exiled people, conquered people, is exalted to the highest position that any woman could have had in the entire world at that time. Just kind of like when you let that sink in. We talk about the providence of God. We talked last week how God is not mentioned in this book, but we can see God moving. This isn't a coincidence. There's a power working here that's greater than Ahasuerus. There's a power at work providentially and orchestrating his own purposes through the emperor. And I don't know if you noticed in the reading, but through all this, up until this part of the story, Esther has kept her Jewishness a secret. And Mordecai told her to do that because there was much anti-Semitism in the Persian Empire. Esther would reveal that she was Jewish, but only at the most very important and necessary time. So, Esther is chosen to be queen. She's gone from being an obscure little Jewish orphan girl to being the queen, and it's all driven at this stage by her physical beauty and her charm. Now, the next part, listen to that because that's about Esther. So there's 4 things that nobody talks about. The next part of the sharing is a taster for what is to come in the next part. Because not long after Esther's crowned, and this is where the story gets twists and turns and fascinating, her cousin Mordecai is sitting at the entrance to the palace. He's hanging around the palace. Well, why do you think he's hanging around the palace? He raised Esther. He's concerned about her. So he hangs around the palace to get whatever word he can from her and about her. And that's why he's hanging around. It says in verse 21, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, they were doorkeepers. They became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Now, Mordecai overheard the plot. And the plot was to kill the king and kill him, to assassinate the king. Now, these were royal officials who guarded the king's private quarters. So they had access to him and they could easily have killed him. They were angry. We're not told why they were angry, but they were angry maybe because of what he'd done to Vashti. Whatever it was that had infuriated them, they were plotting to take his life. And again, you think of the providence of God. Mordecai is the one who overhears it. They don't know he's there. He overheard all this conversation between the two of them. This tells us that Mordecai was in places in the palace that would have been off limits for most people, and that somehow he'd been able to gain a place in the palace where he could hear conversations like this, which is a good indication that he might have held some official prominence in the kingdom, which was maybe Esther got it for him, who knows. But the important thing is he learned about the plot against the king. So he reported it immediately. The message in the Bible, it says, so the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed. Both men were hanged on the gallows. And listen to this. And, quote, it was written in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. The Persians kept records of absolutely everything. That's why we know so much about their history. The king's chroniclers recorded what happened, the plot, that it was overheard by Mordecai, that Mordecai had informed Esther, and Esther had informed the king, and the king's life had been spared, and the two conspirators were hanged. Mordecai's actions were then written down in the royal record. Well, why did they do that? Because these kinds of things needed to be rewarded, and kings knew that. Loyalty needed to be rewarded as much as disloyalty needed to be punished. And at a future day, there would come a time when this man would be rewarded, and we get on this later on in the book, rewarded for saving the life of the king. But like all ancient monarchs, Ahasuerus was careful to honour and reward those who demonstrated loyalty to him. That's how he secured that kind of loyalty. And in order to be able to do that and to do it well, they kept records of acts of valour and special service rendered to the monarch. Now here's the big question. Has anyone worked out any of one, or it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be in order, any one thing about Esther which is never really talked about? Has anyone worked out anything? You know, I'm brave enough to put their hand up. Doesn't matter because I can tell you. You might have worked it out in your head. First thing is, she lived in exile. You know me, I've got to go back to that dictionary because I love dictionaries. And I like a proper book too. I don't like going on my phone and getting it on my phone. You know, you can get the dictionary on your phone. No, I've got a dictionary that thick. Dictionary for exile. Prolonged separation from one's country or home, as by stress of circumstances. Expulsion from one's native land by authoritative decree. The thesaurus, which also is about that thick, says banishment, expulsion, deportation, eviction, separation, ostracism, ousted, cast out, refugee, outcast, deportee. Do any of these words or images relate to what's happening in the world today? Because I'm sure they do with you, as they do with me. And how blessed we are to be in this place today. We're not worrying that someone's going to come and drop a bomb on us or storm in here. Ukraine, it's not like that, and we all know that. So Esther lived in exile. Esther and a significant number of Jewish people were scattered through the Persian Empire after the Babylonian exile. They stayed in exile rather than return to a war-torn Jerusalem. And I thought about those people in Ukraine. I thought, 2 million or 2.5 million have left. How many of them would ever go back? And what is there to go back for? If your home and your city's been bombed to smithereens, what is there to go home for? So Esther lived in exile, but we don't really talk about that. The next thing was, she was an orphan. This is Esther 2:7. And we know that she was raised by her cousin Mordecai. Two things that we don't really talk about. The third thing was, she was taken captive. The Persian king, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, was obviously seeking a replacement for Vashti. So naturally he makes a decree in order to gather to himself all the suitable virgins in the region. Esther 2:8. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had the charge of the women. Now, Esther didn't have much say in this as the matter unfolded. She most likely didn't submit a CV or a resume, or raise her hand and stick her hand up, pick me, take me. She's not likely to volunteer for a harem. She was young, she was pretty, and the bottom line is, she was taken. Not nice when you think about it. And it gets worse. Number 4, the fourth thing that we certainly don't talk about with Esther is that the bottom line is she was raped. She was a victim of sex trafficking. Let's face it. The cold, hard facts are that is a fact. This part comes as a bit of a shocker to people, but the scriptures are pretty clear about what happened. Esther 2:12-14. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. The virgins, who were all quite young, were escorted to the king, who is said to have been about 40 years old at the time. They were taken one by one for him to sleep with. They didn't return to the other virgins, but instead were added to the number of the king's other concubines, that is, sex slaves without the wife's status. No other man could ever be their husband, so their lives have had it. She's had it. They've had it because no other man is ever allowed to marry her, so she'd never have a husband and family. And they could never see the king again unless he was pleased with them. So in short, he'd purchased Esther to replace his former queen. That is the world that Esther lived in. And as I said, she was essentially a victim of human trafficking. So we better get on to something more positive. In these first 2 chapters, we've seen God providentially placing his people. He removed one queen in order to allow another queen, Esther, to take her place. He allowed Mordecai to be in Shushan to begin with, and then to be at the gate to uncover the plot and have his name written down in the book, and that's important for the next sharing. And we will see that as the story unfolds, that these placements were crucial for the survival of the Jews. So God providentially places his people. Think about the first 7 letters of the word providential. P-R-O-V-D-E. Provide. God provides for our lives. Think back over your life. I give you a minute, 30 seconds. Think about over your life. Can you remember a time or a place where God providentially placed a people or a person in your life who provided what you needed at that time? Just let's think about that. Because I can certainly think of specific people who were placed in my life for a specific purpose, and I'm so thankful for God for that. In the words of R.C. Sproul, this guy said, and I rather liked it, God doesn't roll dice. And that's important because later on in the story, we find that dice were rolled, literally. God doesn't roll dice because nothing happens by chance, ever. And as we go through the rest of the story, it's a wonderful book. And I did encourage you last time to read it from beginning to end, and maybe some of you have, and you know what's coming, you know the end. And that's good. Because we can all be reminded that God is in control. And right today, right where we are now, God is in control, just as he was in control and over Esther and her life. He's in charge of how everything turns out. He makes no mistakes. And he has our best interests at heart. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this wonderful story of Esther. We thank you that you were behind every page in that story, every action, every person. We thank you that you had a plan and a purpose, and you planned to use Esther for something pretty amazing. And at the time, we can only imagine what it was like for her to be living in those times and to go through what she had to go through. But we know that in the end, you used her in a mighty, mighty way, and she was very, very brave, and she saved a nation. We thank you that you had that plan for her, but we just pray this morning, because we know that you have a plan for each one of us in our lives. Help us to remember that you don't throw dice. Nothing's a mistake. Nothing is an accident. Nothing comes by chance. Help us to be aware of those moments when you place people. It might be just a chance meeting of a person, someone who comes into our lives and then goes again. But Father, you send them for a reason. We thank you for that. And we just pray that this week you'll make us very aware of who we meet, and Lord, make us aware that you might have you've sent that person to encourage us, to give us some encouragement for the week, because sometimes life does get tough. And you know that too. And so we just commit next week and whatever it holds into your hands, knowing that you're a providential God, that you provide. And we thank you that we can trust in you and your love for each one of us. Amen.